On behalf of the National Archives and Records Administration, I welcome you to our Becoming America lecture series. This is the first of 18 lectures scheduled at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. As one of only 14 presidential libraries operated by the National Archives and Records Administration, the subject of how America came to be, how we gained and secured our freedom and created self-government is the essence of our mission. We believe that access to and education about our government allows Americans to understand their history so they can fully participate in shaping our future. This lecture is the brainchild of Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham, the director of the Center for Civics Education at Concordia University in Irvine. She and her colleagues have worked tirelessly to craft an educational and entertaining lecture series that we hope you will enjoy. Lectures will last 45 minutes with a question and answer format following. Please email me your questions at rachel.fisher@nara.gov, or if you're joining us in the audience today and have a question, please reach out to our staff members here on site. Now, please help me in welcoming Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here this evening. And don't worry that you're a small audience. We're not worried about it. COVID is finally over and people are getting out. But the good news is that all of these lectures will be taped and being streamed live, in fact, and then they will be on YouTube so you can watch them. In fact, I don't expect anyone to attend all 18 lectures. In fact, I don't know that I would, but I would pick out the ones that I found most interesting. And on your way out, there's something I'd like you to pick up. You're not going to be able to see it very well, but you'll get the point. I could ask you, when was the last time you read the Constitution? And someone might say, well, it was last week, it was 2 weeks ago, 8th grade, whenever it was. And so then my next question is, well, would you read it again if you got around to it? And they say, oh, sure. So we give them around to it. It says TUIT on this, and then they smile and say, oh, isn't that clever? And then we tell them, if you turn it over, there's a QR code. And on that QR code is the Constitution. So while on your way out, you can pick up a pocket copy of the Constitution, pick up one of these as well, pick up more than one if you like. And you can always have the Constitution literally in your pocket or in your purse. First of all, I'd like to thank very much the folks at NARA, the Richard Nixon Library archival folks. They've been so cooperative and so encouraging, helpful with this project. And also the Nixon Foundation, which has helped to promote it as well. There was a survey done about 2 years ago by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. And using questions from the immigration test, that some of you have had to take if you become a citizen. And using 50,000 people as their survey cohort, they learned that using those questions, surveying those people, a majority of people in only one state could pass that test. That's astonishing. 50,000 Americans representing all 50 states, and the state that actually was able to pass was Vermont, and they passed with what would be the equivalent of a D grade. Self-government is based on a population that understands their country, they understand how it works. They don't have to be political scientists, but they have to have a basic level of knowledge in order to vote intelligently and to participate. So we set up a Center of Civics Education at Concordia University at Irvine to take on this task. There are many others doing this across the country. They do it in different ways, but ours is geared toward Orange County, California specifically. Okay, this is what I want you to be thinking about if you can. Go back in time and history, and you can visualize this to however you want to visualize it. There's a small group of men, perhaps several dozen. They hold positions of influence and in some cases power in the part of the country that they come from. Most of them come from the northeast part of the country, although they are actually some from the rest of the country. They've met before, generally in, move it forward. Well, I'll keep going while he's looking. They've met before, but when they have met before, it's generally in small groups and generally in secret because they wanted to be away from the prying eyes of the king and his agents. But this time they've come together to meet as a group. And they're meeting openly. It's not a secret. People know why they're there. They've been emboldened by the king's simple refusal to redress their grievances. They've had these grievances for some time. They've complained. The king and his government have refused to respond in any meaningful way. One of the biggest issues is the level of taxation, the incredible burdens of taxation that the king has imposed, primarily to pay for the debts incurred by a recent war. They have finally readied themselves for a confrontation. They basically told the king, if you don't address us, we will fight. They've actually gotten the clergy involved because the church is concerned about the welfare of the people. But they've compiled a list of royal abuses, and they've listed them on this paper. Some of these include due process of law being violated, trial by jury being violated, habeas corpus being violated by the king and his minions, presentment by a grand jury had been violated. They had quartered soldiers in the homes of people without their consent. There were onerous taxes that I had also mentioned before, but to make it even worse, they were being taxed without representation. The king refuses to be moved. He's resolute on retaining his prerogatives. So this ancient band of brothers has finally come together, and they have said this: address our grievances and acquiesce to our demands, or we will rebel, though it be an act of treason. Our duty requires it. So the king remains unyielding, and this means war. War takes place, and it's a war that the king will lose. And this war will go down in history as the war that was fought over a piece of paper, actually words on parchment, that were sent out to the people around the country and contained the grievances against the king demanding their rights. Upon approval by this group of men, it was sent out throughout the kingdom, and the people were able to read it. The war took place, the king lost, and freedom began to reign. Interestingly, through this entire process, there was one indispensable man, one man that literally the country would not have survived. This whole process would not have survived without this man who was known for his loyalty, for his honesty, and his ability to lead men. Took them through the war, they won the war, and after the war was called back into service for civilian duty, not to rule and reign over the country like a king, but to administer the country. Also, this individual, this indispensable man, would leave no heirs, no sons to carry on his name throughout history. What does this conjure up in your mind? Anybody? What are we talking about? Show the next slide, please. Obviously, this is King George, 1776. This is the Declaration of Independence. Now show the next slide. This is King John in 1215, Magna Carta. All of those circumstances that I just related exactly fit both of those historical events. So history does repeat itself. If I told you those facts in the United States, most people would instinctively say, what was the Revolutionary War? And it's George Washington. But if you go to England and ask people that same question, they would say, well, that was King John and that was Magna Carta. And yet, what is most important is that our problems as colonials in 1776 were very much the same as they were 500 years before in England. Next slide, please. Royal abuses, violation of due process, abandonment of trial by jury, violation of habeas corpus, unlawful searches and seizures, all of these things that they were dealing with in 1215, 500 years, we're still dealing with. The history is incredible. But what is so important about these two events is that it proved, or was the beginning of proving, that man should not be ruled by man. Man should be ruled by law. There were limits on royal authority. The king was not above the law. The king had to live under the law like everyone else. And also the people had a right to redress their grievances. And if you look at what these documents said, next slide, please. Magna Carta said, now, by the way, much of Magna Carta is no longer applicable, hasn't been applicable for years. In other words, who cares about whether the fish weirs in the Thames River should be there or not? There were provisions about how widows should be taken care of, how debts to Jews should be paid. A lot of those things no longer are applicable. But these two parts of the Magna Carta are still valid today, and they were the foundation of American liberties. First one says that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of the equals or by the law of the land. That is what King John was forced to admit to. And the other statement, Clause 40 of Magna Carta, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. So 500 years later, based on those principles, as we'll show during this lecture, we have our own Declaration of Independence, which every American knows, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I mentioned an indispensable man because you can have these wonderful statements on a piece of parchment or on a piece of paper. I mean, many countries around the world have bills of rights, but they don't have freedoms. So you can have it written down, but unless it's operationalized, it doesn't mean anything. So how was the Magna Carta operationalized? Well, it was pretty much the same as it was operationalized in the United States. It took two things. It took a civil war, and it took an indispensable man. And these are the two indispensable men. The man on my right, your left, was William Marshall. He was born in the late 1100s. He had served Henry II and three of Henry's sons, namely Henry the Younger, Richard Lionheart, and then King John, bad King John, who was the brother to Richard Lionheart. William Marshall was a knight. He was known throughout Europe, not just England, throughout Europe, as being super effective with his sword and with horsemanship. He was a great knight. But he was also known for his integrity. He was trusted. When the two brothers rebelled against Henry II, depending on who William Marshall was working for at the time, he was loyal to that person, which meant times he changed, not because he changed, but because his employer changed. He was known for that loyalty and his integrity. He was the only one who could bring the barons together. Now, on Runnymede, the fields of Runnymede, in 1215, King John was forced to not sign the Magna Carta. He probably couldn't write anyway, but he could read. But he sealed it. He put his seal on the Magna Carta. Within 2 months, it was dead. King John violated it. The barons violated it. And Pope Innocent, who was kind of in cahoots with a lot of people on this, he declared it null and void. So Magna Carta is dead and the Civil War begins. The barons are so upset with King John that they actually invited Prince Louis of France to come over and be king. He was fighting in the wars. Good for the country. Around October of 1216, the next year, King John died of dysentery. They believe he ate some bad peaches. But he died, but on his deathbed, he said to William Marshall, who was in his service at the time, he said, "Make my son king." Well, first of all, become king, you have to be knighted. The boy was 9 years old. So William Marshall made sure that they found the boy, brought him in, they knighted him, crowned him king, and so they took care of the succession. But the war still had to be fought, and it was William Marshall in the final Battle of Lincoln where they defeated the French. William Marshall was late 60s, early 70s at this time, went into battle without his helmet. He was an incredible man. The French were defeated, the barons were defeated, and this 9-year-old king who doesn't know anything, obviously he's a child, one of the first things that William Marshall did as the regent of England is he reissued Magna Carta. It was worded slightly different, but it was essentially the same, and then they reissued it again the following year. The point of this is without William Marshall, there would be no Magna Carta. And there was no man that could have brought England together because he was so respected by both sides. And of course, we know the story of George Washington, how George Washington led the Revolutionary Army. In fact, he lost more battles than he won, but we won the war. And after the war, he wanted to go home. In fact, he got on a barge from New York City and sailed home to Mount Vernon. But he was called, just like William Marshall, he was called back into civil service to chair the Constitutional Convention, and then later on to become the first president of the United States. And when George Washington was, when he had died, his eulogy was written by Chief Justice John Marshall, although John Marshall was not Chief Justice at that time. But Marshall wrote the eulogy, which was read by Light Horse Harry Lee. And just like William Marshall, he was so respected. The people trusted Washington. No one could have brought the country together like Washington did. And we know that because so many people in history wrote this. We know what he did. And in his eulogy, that Light Horse Harry Lee, of his character, he said, vice stuttered in his presence. Just think of that. Vice, evil things. In the presence of George Washington, vice stuttered. And then he went on to say that he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Well, we know that Washington had no children. William Marshall had 5 sons, but none of those had sons. So for both men, there were no descendants to carry on the family name. Okay, next slide, please. There was something that happened between 1214 and 1776 that's really important. And it took place in a little town called Bury St. Edmunds in England. Bury St. Edmunds was a small village at the time, but it was also the home of one of the largest and most beautiful cathedrals all in Europe. And it's not there now, it's all in ruins because King Henry VIII, when he took over the church property and left the Catholic Church and so on, the people came and basically tore down the church and used the stones for their homes. But in any event, when you go to this place in Bury St. Edmunds, there's a huge gardens, they're beautiful gardens, and there are 2 plaques. They're about maybe 100 yards apart. The one that you can see here on the right says, near this spot on the 20th of November AD 1214, Cardinal Langton and the barons swore at St. Edmund's altar that they would obtained from King John ratification of Magna Carta. So before they met with King John at Magna Carta, or at Runnymede and caught up with him, they had met literally in secret at the high altar of the cathedral in Bury St. Edmunds. That's when they took an oath: we will force John or we will rebel. Well, he didn't accept him. They caught him up at Runnymede 8 months later, and they rebelled. But then, like I say, about 100 yards away, in an old ancient graveyard, there's this plaque. And the plaque says, in memory of Captain Bartholomew Gosnold, explorer and prime mover behind the first permanent English settlement in North America, where he died on August 22nd, 1607. Now, who was this man, Gosnold? And this picture below is supposed to represent Gosnold's boat and the waves or the Atlantic Ocean. So next slide, please. Bartholomew Gosnold is really our first founding father, and most people have never heard of him. If you live on Martha's Vineyard, there's a small statue of him on the beach and a very small little museum. Most people have never heard about this man, but he's critically important. He was born in 1571, and he moved his family to Bury St. Edmunds later on. He attended James College at Cambridge University, and I went there in search of what did he study there, and they couldn't find his records. I mean, they were kind of old, but they did give me a copy of the bill that he and others paid for their education at Jesus College. I did go to Jesus College. That's where he studied, and then he went to the Middle Inn in London and studied law. While he was studying law, he came in contact with a lot of people. His family was pretty well connected, but he met people such as Sir Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, and others who were explorers or privateers, and he was actually able to go on a voyage with the Earl of Essex as a privateer, and they went out to harass the Spanish ships. He got the bug for exploration. One of his friends and mentors was a man by the name of Richard Hakluyt. I can never pronounce his name correctly, but he happened to be one of the great geographers in England. He was also a teacher, and for some years he had been pushing the idea of colonizing North America, that part that was supposedly taken by the English. So Gosnold was very interested in this, and he began his own campaign of establishing a colony in the English part of the New World. Now, at that time, Virginia, as it was called, went from about Canada down to Florida. It was the whole east coast of North America. They didn't know much about inland, but they knew about the coast because Walter Raleigh and others had been here. They had charted it. Walter Raleigh had actually tried to start a colony, and if you remember your history, became the lost colony of Roanoke, because when he went back to England and then they came back later, there was no trace of the colonists. By 1601 or 1603, Gosnold has fulfilled part of his dream. He's got 31 men, and he's got a boat. And the boat's not real big. The keel length of the boat was 39 feet, and the breadth of the boat was 17.5 feet. We're not talking about an ocean liner here, but it was a boat. And they were the first to cross from England. It's not on the map, but from England, explorers and sailors used to go down through, by past Portugal, down to the Azores, and then up to the coast of North America. He was the first to actually make almost a direct crossing from England to North America. And again, that was because of his friend, Richard Hakluyt, who was the one who had done a lot of the scientific calculations to make this happen. So they actually made the crossing in about 7 weeks. They landed in what would today be about Portland, Maine. They were here for about a month. They built a small cabin. They had intended to create a colony, but they weren't quite ready to do this. They encountered Native Americans on a couple of times. It was generally friendly, but tense, and they were just unsure. So they decided to go back. But while they were there, they charted the coast of New England along Massachusetts, that area. He charted it much more carefully than Raleigh had. And they found an island, and the island was just full of grapes. It was a lush island. And he named that island after his young daughter, who had died, age 2. Her name was Martha. They named the place Martha's Vineyard. And they had caught so many fish, because that's what they ate for most of their time. They caught so many fish, they finally named the place Cape Cod. And they also named the Elizabeth Island, which is off the coast of Massachusetts as well. So as I say, he wasn't prepared to stay, so he went back after about a month. He felt kind of like he was a failure because he hadn't founded the colony, but he wasn't discouraged. So he spent the next 4 years putting together a new expedition. He had to organize a crew. He had to get more men. He needed financial support because these things aren't free. And by the way, his financial support came from a lot of investors, including Richard Hakluyt, but also Sir Thomas Smythe, who was one of the wealthiest merchants in London, and some other investors. And very importantly, he got a charter from King James. Now, you notice he named Elizabeth Island after Queen Elizabeth. That's because she was queen, but she died in 1603, and so by the time Gosnold is ready with his second voyage, we have a new monarch, James I. So he got the charter from King James, and it created the Virginia Company of London. So now he's ready to come back. And this time he's got, in 1606, he's got 3 ships, the Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. He's got 100 men who could be settlers. That's what they were supposed to be, settlers, colonists. Although they were not very rough and tough men. They were kind of cityfied people, didn't know what they were getting into. He had a crew of about 55, and of course they were all men and gentlemen adventurers. There was one person, though, on the voyage that he recruited. His name was John Smith. You remember that from your history. John Smith was an adventurer. He was an explorer. He was a soldier. He had fought against the Turks. He had been captured and put in Turkish slavery. Quite a history. He was a controversial man, too, but he was probably the one man who had any idea about how you survive under these conditions. So they set out, and finally, after several months, because they had trouble getting started, and this time they also went down south by the Azores and came up, and they found a place in Chesapeake Bay where they said this might be a good place to start a colony. Now, interestingly, the Virginia Company of London admired Gosnold. They believed in him. They were supporting him. But they put someone else in command of the expedition who had more experience. It was Christopher Newport. But they put Gosnold in position number 2. So when they finally decide on the James River, which they named after King James, obviously, this is where we're going to found a colony. Now, they didn't know much about mosquitoes and swamps and all of that, but it looked like a good place to start. And when they landed and decided this is where it's going to be, they opened up a sealed letter that had come from the company, remained sealed until they decided where to found the colony. In the letter were instructions, and there were 7 names. These names were to be the council that would then elect one of them amongst the group to be the governor of Jamestown. And Gosnold's name was first on the list. One reason we don't know enough about Gosnold, sadly, is because he was one of the ones who died. And if you remember, they founded the colony in the spring, and by August, it was what they started calling the dying time because of disease. They just weren't prepared, and he was one of the ones who died. He was 36 years old. Interestingly, in about 2003, they think they found his burial grave. They found him, his remains. They're not 100% sure, but they're about 90% sure that it's him because they've been doing a lot of archaeological investigation. And it bothers me when this man, who was responsible for creating this expedition, which is responsible for the first settlement, English settlement, in the New World by the English, doesn't get much credit. Some historians give him credit, but then I read things like this. I read this in a book not too long ago. Christopher Newport was the captain in charge of the 3 ships. He and John Smith clashed during the voyage, and lucky for him, Smith only escaped being hanged for mutiny when sealed orders were opened that named him one of the leaders of the new colony. Well, that's not quite accurate. He almost was hanged for mutiny by Captain Newport, but it wasn't when they opened the letters. It was actually when they stopped in the Azores. But the one who saved him from being hanged was Gosnold. as well as the chaplain on the ship, because Gosnold said, we're going to need this man. So long before Pocahontas saved John Smith, Gosnold did. So why do we bring Gosnold up? For a couple of reasons. Historically, he was the first one to make that direct crossing from England to the central portion of our American coast. Secondly, he secured that charter, which was incredibly important. And I'll talk a little bit about the charter a little bit later. Then he organized this expedition. Now you could say, oh, well, somebody else could have. True, but the point is he did. No one else did. He did it. And the fourth point is he traveled with, and we'll go to the next slide, please. He traveled in the circles with Sir Edward Coke, spelled K-O-C-O-K-E, but pronounced Cook. This is one of the most important men in the history of law and jurisprudence, not only in England, but in the United States. There's a picture of him. He was an attorney, obviously. He was also a law professor. He was elected to Parliament in 1589 while Elizabeth was still king, Elizabeth I. A couple of years later, he was elected Speaker of the House of Commons. And then by 1593, he was Attorney General of England. And then he became Chief Justice of the King's Bench in 1613. Now, by this time, 1613, he's under the rule of King James. Now, King James had a different attitude than Parliament did about the role of the king. King James believed in the divine right of kings. I'm put here as king by God, and I rule for God, by God, and under God's legitimacy. But that didn't set too well with some people, and Sir Edward Coke was one of those. In fact, even though he had been appointed Chief Justice of the King's Bench, he still had this burning idea of the Magna Carta, and I'll get into that in just a minute. But King James actually wrote a book about the divine right of kings called The True Law of Free Monarchies, which I think is almost an oxymoron to talk about free monarchies. But he said in that book, the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth. For kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even God himself calls them gods. So he had a pretty high opinion of what a king should be. But as early as 1607, Coke had been challenging the king. The king attempted to engage or insert himself in some trials, in some judicial matters. And Coke asserted, no, the king, you do not do justice and with judges, that's what we do. Well, the king didn't like that too well. But a few years later, it got even worse because Coke just kind of pressed. But there was a case in which the king made a decision about some ecclesiastical property. You know, the church was very powerful in England under the Catholics and then again under the Anglicans. And there was a cleric who had some property, and the king said, well, he can keep his property, and it was a lot of property, whether or not he's performing services. And Coke said, no, you can't do that. And the court of the King's Bench said, no, that is not legal. So the king told the court, change your minds. And they all did, except Coke. He refused to change his mind. He stood on principle, and for that, he was removed as Chief Justice of the King's Bench. But a couple of years later, he was reelected to Parliament, but in Parliament, he continued to be a source of irritation to the king, particularly when an issue came up. James I wanted his son, Charles I, to marry a Spanish princess. The problem is she was Catholic. And in those days, the rivalry between Catholics and Protestants was very strong. And both Coke and Parliament said, no, we will not have a Catholic princess because she could become queen and we will not have a Catholic rule over us. And so the issue then morphed into an issue of freedom of speech because Parliament was speaking out against the king and the king was telling them to be quiet. And they said, no, we have the right to speak out. And Coke's answer was this: if my sovereign will not allow me my inheritance, and by inheritance he meant free speech, I must fly to Magna Carta, the Charter of Liberty, because it makes free men. And Coke advised Parliament, he said, we should put our opinion about this marriage in writing. Well, they did so. They followed his opinion, and they did that on December 18th, 1621, and 9 days later, Coke finds himself in the Tower of London. They have arrested him. They have confiscated most of his writings. They confiscated 37 volumes, 34 of which were later returned. And he had nothing to write on, no writing utensils or papers while he was in the tower. So he continued to write his Institutes of the Laws of England with coal on the walls. He was in the tower for about 7 or 8 months. Well, in the meantime, by 1625, James I died. Coke is still living, still in Parliament. Now they're fighting with his son, Charles I. And you talk about losing a war. Charles I not only lost the war, he lost his head. He was beheaded. But during 1628, the English Parliament drafted the British Petition of Right. And today, that is one of the 3 documents in England that is considered to be part of the English Constitution. Coke died in 1634, and on his deathbed, while Charles is still living, on his deathbed, Charles has all of his writings confiscated, and Charles went through them himself. He wanted to see what he had been writing. And most of Coke's writings were not released until a number of years after his death, particularly because Parliament voted to have his writings published. Now, he had written those writings largely as textbooks for law students, and they were the major laws of England, which were explained with the history and the meaning, how they had been adjudicated, and so on. But the most important of those for our purposes, and for English purposes as well, was the second part of the Institutes of the Laws of England. And when you open up to the first section, you will get this. This is a facsimile. It's kind of hard to read because it's just really hard to read, the scribbling and that sort of thing. But it was all about Magna Carta. Up to that time, for the last many hundred years, Magna Carta was important, but most of it, as I said, had already been obsolete, except for those couple of really important clauses. Remember, no free man shall be taken or imprisoned or disseized of his freehold or liberties except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To Coke, this was the root from which sprang all the branches of English liberties, and these were published after his death. In fact, his writings became the foundation of the arguments used against Charles I and were used here in the United States later. He resurrected the foundations of Magna Carta. He applied Magna Carta to the common man. The original Magna Carta was really a deal between the king and the barons, but Coke took it further, between king and the common man. It became the basis for the Petition of Right, which I already mentioned. And if any statement of Coke's is the most important in all of his life, it's this: Magna Carta is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign. In other words, the law is supreme. So Charles was executed in 1649. Coke had died 15 years earlier, but his writings lived on. They lived on for generations. They live on today. Next slide, please. I love this picture on my right, your left. This is Arthur Berdmore. This was a writer, a publisher in England about this same time in the 1700s. And he had some difficulties with the king and even with Parliament, because free speech, free press, these things were still, they weren't as free as what you and I are used to. And he had printed kind of a satire about Lord Bute and the king's mother, and it was considered inappropriate, and so he was going to be arrested for printing something like that. So he knew he was going to be arrested, so he made sure when he was arrested, he would be teaching about the Magna Carta to his son. And that's the picture that came out of that, which is really important. Coke's Institute became the basis of the study of law in England, but also the study of law in the United States. Remember, we were British. Everything we did came from British law. And Coke's writings formed the basis of our American law for more than 2 centuries, became the standard law text. Harvard University, Brown University, even in the mid-1700s, early 1700s, were using Coke's writings. And they especially found his writings on Magna Carta to be appealing. Our founding fathers were steeped in the language and the philosophy of Magna Carta, especially as expounded by Coke. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Rutledge, George Mason, James Otis, all of them knew Coke very well. John Rutledge said that Coke's institutes seemed to be almost the foundation of our law. Thomas Jefferson said that this was the universal elementary textbook of law students. And if you look at this, to the top of the screen on the right, on my far right, that is the seal of Massachusetts in 1775. And the man in the middle there is holding Magna Carta in one hand. And then these are just other pictures. Rhode Island, the founder of Rhode Island was mentored by Sir Edward Coke, became the basis of the Massachusetts Constitution. The first real legal clash we had with the British was over the writs of assistance in the early 1760s. And a writ of assistance was basically a general warrant. We can search your property for any reason, for whatever. Well, we didn't like those very well. We don't like them today. In fact, I think that's being argued in the courts today about the kind of writ that was issued in the case of Trump. But in those days, a writ of assistance was basically the person who was requesting the writ did not have to say under oath what they were looking for. So it was basically somebody issues a writ, you can go and get whatever they want. So James Otis argued the case for the Boston merchants against whom these writs had been issued. What did he rely on? He relied on the arguments of Coke and Magna Carta. Next slide, please. Over the centuries, literally 2 centuries, the colonies had become more and more estranged from England. Largely distance, 3,000 miles today is nothing. You get on a jetliner and you're there in a couple of hours. In those days, it was a long, treacherous, dangerous voyage. And the colonies kind of grew up almost as orphans by themselves, used to governing themselves. They were basically treated by the British by benign neglect. You know, you do your thing, we won't bother you. But in the meantime, the colonies were expanding. They were growing. Their commerce was increasing. They were expanding westward. And our interests as colonists became different than those of the mother country. And then we had a war, by the way, which George Washington started by accident. And in the United States, we called it the French and Indian War. In Europe, they called the 7 Years' War. When that war ended, and like I said, about 7 years, the immediate impact was that France, who lost the war, lost all claims to Canada, gave Louisiana to the Spanish. Britain got Spanish Florida, Upper Canada, and some others. So there was a shift in the international power balance, but it really benefited us because no longer did we have to worry about the French and the Spanish, and the Mississippi became much more available to us. It was an expensive war, and we had fought in that war here, but the British had fought here as well as in Europe. And when the war ended, the British felt, you know what, those colonists over there, we defended them, we need them to pay for the war. So they started imposing taxes. The British began to assert their authority. They demanded taxation, they demanded obedience. Well, by this time, we had already begun to assert more of our rights in a more coherent way, such as Otis did with the writs of assistance, because we didn't like being taxed without representation. But in 1763, Britain historically was probably a pretty big mistake. They effectively closed off the frontier to the colonists. They addressed the concerns of the Native Americans, which is probably a good thing, regarding westward expansion, but it hurt the colonies. And they placed all the Indians under the protection of the king. So the colonists began to feel squeezed. You're telling us what to do, you're taxing us. And it got worse when the next year they passed the Revenue Act, which was a sugar tax. And it wasn't even a new tax. It was an old tax, the molasses tax, that was supposed to expire. So they basically extended it. But it was just one more, you're squeezing us too much. Then the following year, the Currency Act, that there was no standard currency in the colonies. So Britain began to control the colonial currency system when they set up new courts. The colonists were already beginning to rebel, riots, arguments, all kinds of ruffian type stuff going on. So you can see those acts listed there. Go to the next slide, please. This is Patrick Henry, because what happened in 1765, that was kind of the needle that broke the camel's back. Parliament passed a law called the Stamp Act. They wanted the Americans to pay more for the war. The Stamp Act was basically a stamp that had to be placed on all kinds of paper goods, cards, stationery, newspapers, documents, parcels, all kinds of things. It was the first real attempt of the British to assert their control. And we weren't real happy with that and began to do things like hang the stamp collector in effigy, burn down his house, hold riots in the streets. It was not pleasant. Interestingly enough, there were people in the British Parliament who agreed with us. And one of them was an Irishman who had been born in Ireland and was now in England, and he was in Parliament. His name was Isaac Barré. I don't know if you've heard of him. But he said, what we're doing to our brothers and sisters in America is wrong. These regulations, the Stamp Act, these are bad things. We should not do them. And at one point he said, we are the mother country. Let us be cautious not to get the name of stepmother. Well, Charles Townsend had a response to that. He said, well, now, will these Americans, children planted by our care, nourished by our indulgence until grown to a degree of strength and opulence, protected by our arms, will they grudge to constitute a might to relieve us from the heavy weight of that burden under which we lie for their defense? In other words, very condescending. And Barré thundered his opposition. They, planted by your care, they, nourished by your indulgence, they grew by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them in one department or another and to prey upon them. Men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them. That phrase, sons of liberty, that was the watchword. When the Americans heard that, bands of young patriots, usually young men, began to gather to fight back the British. They took the name Sons of Liberty. They got it from Isaac Barré. Any of you ever been to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania? Where did Wilkes-Barre get its name? Well, the Barre part is from Isaac Barré. The Wilkes part is for another man in England at the time who was put in prison in the Tower and received all kinds of persecution because he believed in freedom of the press. So Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, 2 men for freedom. Well, the news reached the colonies in May of 1765, and there was immediate outrage. This is when Patrick Henry made his great statement before the Virginia House of Burgesses. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III, and at that point the record tells us that some men in the House were yelling, treason, treason, but he continued. He said, George III may profit by their example, and if this be treason, make the most of it. And of course, 10 years later, Patrick Henry would say something again. He would say, gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually here. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Now, in 1766, the protests began to give way, not just you're oppressing us, but there began to be stirs of maybe we shouldn't be a part of this realm after all. But at this point, those are just underlying. What was more pressing was to do something about the Stamp Act. So for the first time in colonial history, the colonies got together for the single purpose of standing up to the British, and this was called the Stamp Act Congress. It was an informal group. It was an illegal group, but they met from October 7th to the 25th. Most of the colonies attended, not all. They met in New York City. Among the attendees were James Otis. We've talked about him already. Sam Adams, you know that name, not the beer, but the man, who was one of the major leaders of the revolution. John Dickinson, who became the penman of the revolution, and Caesar Rodney, and we'll come to him in just a few minutes. This was the first collaborative action of the American colonies against the British. And they passed 13 different resolutions. One, they had a right to be represented in Parliament. They had the right to choose their own representatives. No taxation without representation. No trial without a jury. They had the right to petition. All of this goes back to what? Goes back to Magna Carta. Next one, please. Next slide. Well, the public reaction, I just said, to the Stamp Act was horrible. Rioting, demonstrations, hanging in effigy, and all of this kind of thing. Parliament was startled. They said, wait a minute, you've been our colonists for a couple of hundred years now. We've taxed you before. We've regulated you before. Why are you so upset now? They were astonished by the colonial reaction. Well, Benjamin Franklin was living in London at the time. He was a representative for Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and a couple of other colonies. He was also internationally known as a scientist. He was very highly regarded. So they brought Benjamin Franklin before the Parliament, and they questioned him for about an hour. They said, what's going on? Why are you people so upset? And Edmund Burke, I'm sure you've heard that name in history, he was a member of that Parliament, and he said as he watched this Q&A, as we would call it today, he said it was like the examination of a master by a parcel of schoolboys. Franklin was incredible. He tried to explain why the Stamp Act was different than previous taxes, and that's a whole other story we won't go into. But at the end, when he talked about rights, our rights as Englishmen, he was asked the question, where do you get this notion? What are you talking about? Where do you get these ideas? And he said there were two places he got them. One was the charters that created these colonies. Remember I said earlier about the charter that Gosnold got from King John? Part of that charter said this: all and every person and every of their children which shall happen to be born within the colony shall have and enjoy all liberties, franchises, and immunities as if they had been born within our realm of England. In other words, according to 1606 in this charter, we were English. Our children would be English, whether or not we ever went back to Great Britain. And that language or similar language was placed in most of the charters. So Benjamin Franklin said, I got these ideas of liberty from the charters that created these colonies, and the other source was Magna Carta. The same thing that the barons had fought for hundreds of years before. The Stamp Act was then repealed, and the Americans are pretty happy, but we also had a great advocate, even in that repeal, an advocate for America. His name was William Pitt. He was the political leader who had successfully gotten England through the 7 Years' War. He was highly revered, known as the Great Commoner, because for decades he refused to take the title that he was offered. Finally, they offered him the title. I'm proud to say he was the Earl of Chatham. We're not related. I wish we were. But he took our side in the debate over repeal. And I love what he said. He said, the colonists are the subjects of this kingdom, equally entitled with yourselves to all the natural rights of mankind and the peculiar privileges of Englishmen. And he said, the Americans are the children, not the bastards of England. I think that's a wonderful comment. Okay, next slide, please. Things didn't get better, they got worse. The Stamp Act was repealed, we were happy. The problem is the British felt humiliated. They were defeated. How can we let these upstart colonials tell us what to do? So the same time they repealed the Stamp Act, they insisted on exercising its authority, and they passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said this: whereas several of the houses of representatives in His Majesty's colonies of America, that was us, have of late, against law, claimed to themselves the sole and exclusive right imposing duties and taxes upon His Majesty's subjects in the said colonies, and have passed certain votes, resolutions, and orders derogatory to their Parliament, their feelings were hurt. Be it declared, and listen to these words because some of them will come back. Be it declared that said colonies and plantations in America have been, are, and of right ought to be subordinate to the dependency of the imperial crown and Parliament of Great Britain. And with the Declaratory Act, they nullified all of the resolutions and acts that had been passed by the colonies. To make matters worse, Charles Townshend, the one who talked about us being the children, they passed the Townshend Revenue Act, which imposed new taxes on glass, paint, lead, paper, tea, and other items. Reaction, no question, more mob rule, more mob riots. Boston then was occupied by British troops. The Tea Act was passed in 1773, and it wasn't even to raise money. It was to protect the English or the East India Company. But again, one more regulation. What did we do? Well, we all know about the Boston Tea Party. Then they passed the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, which abrogated the Massachusetts Charter. We can just go on, and it just got worse. Please, next slide. Tensions escalated, and I'll go through this quickly. We know there's a Boston Massacre in 1770. The British had occupied Boston, and there were some young kids being kind of smart-alecky, and they were taunting the British soldiers, and it turned into a melee, a talking match, and then eventually a shooting match. A couple of people were killed, and some British soldiers were put on trial. Those British soldiers were actually defended by John Adams, who was a patriot. But he was a man of the law, and he knew that these British soldiers deserved a fair trial, and he got them off. Then there was the Boston Tea Party. All of these things are happening until September of 1774. The First Continental Congress was held. All of the states except Georgia attended. They really weren't looking to separate. There were feelings throughout the country, it's time for us to go, but that would mean war. They were still trying to work it out with Great Britain, so they agreed on a boycott. If we boycott British goods and we'll make our own, that will hurt them. But the pressure was growing and growing. This time, Patrick Henry said, the distinction between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. And then, of course, a year later, Henry will say this, our brethren are already in the field. Why do we stand here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet? And again, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty and give me death. And it was just a couple of months later, we had Paul Revere riding out to Lexington and Concord to announce that the British are coming. The Second Continental Congress was held in May of 1775, still not ready for separation. And they sent a petition directly to the king, not to the parliament, but directly to the king. King George III now is the king. And it was called the Olive Branch Petition, trying to say we can work this out. But the king wouldn't even accept it. He wouldn't even read it. So what do we have? Next slide, please. Next slide. In the Continental Congress, there's finally a vote on July 2nd, 1776, to separate from Great Britain. And I'm going to come back to that date in just a minute, and we're getting close to the end. But go to the next slide, please. This was the war. It really began at Lexington and Concord in April of 75 and lasted until the treaty was signed in 1783. And here you've got King George and George Washington. Next slide, please. It was a bloody war, and if you look at the statistics, John Adams once said about a third of the American people were for independence, about a third were against it, and about a third didn't care either way, or they probably lived out in the West where they weren't terribly affected. That number has been disputed, but what has not been disputed is the fact that our country was divided. There were some who were loyal to the king. Many of them went over and fought with the British. Some of them left America altogether. Others stayed to fight. And in fact, New York City was occupied throughout the entire war, and the very last British soldiers to leave America left from New York City. About 25,000 Americans died during that war. Oddly enough, only about 8,000 died of battle wounds. Most of the others died through disease, privation or smallpox. About 24,000 British soldiers died, and about the same, only 1,200 were battle deaths, about 18,000 were of disease, again, mostly smallpox. There were Germans here fighting, they were mercenaries fighting for the British. They had about 1,200 battle deaths, 6,500 died of disease, and after the war, many of the Germans stayed in the United States and became Americans. Next slide, please. You missed one. Go back. Nope, that one. That's the slide. This is the last story I'll tell, but this is a great one. I mentioned earlier that Caesar Rodney had been at the Stamp Act Congress. They were meeting in the Second Continental Congress, and the issue was no longer, once the Olive Petition was denied or not even read, now separation became more important. This was inevitable. But at the Continental Congress, this decision had to be unanimous. Now, you could send several people representing your colony to the Congress, but each state would have only one vote, so the members of that delegation would have to figure out how they were going to vote for that state. And July 1st, Richard Henry Lee formally proposed this, that these united colonies are, and this will sound familiar, are and of right ought to be, but in this case, free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. All political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is totally dissolved. Now, as I said, the rules required unanimity. There were 12 states there. New York was absent. They hadn't received their instructions. So they had to have 12 states vote for independence. And it's July 1st. They've been talking. They took a straw vote, 9-2. It looked like South Carolina and Pennsylvania, who had said, no, we're not going to vote for independence. They were on the fence. It's pretty obvious that they were going to turn around. That left one state, and that state was Delaware. Delaware had 3 delegates. One was named Thomas McKean. He was for independence. The second delegate was George Reed. He was against independence. The third delegate, Caesar Rodney, this man, was absent. So if you have 1-1, that's a no vote. You've got to have a majority. So Tom McKean had the presence of mind to literally go across the street and hired an express writer. He said, get Caesar, about 90 miles away up in Delaware, and he said, we need him for the vote tomorrow. They knew the vote would be taken on July 2nd. So the express writer got up Caesar Rodney in the middle of the night. Caesar Rodney was home in bed. He also was in ill health. By the way, he was the head of the militia in his part of the country, and that's why he was there. He was back doing militia work. But he had a cancer that had largely eaten away part of his nose, and he usually wore a scarf over his face to hide that because it wasn't very attractive. Woking him up about middle of the night, and they said, we need you. They're going to vote. We need your vote. So he stuffed some biscuits in his pocket, got his horse, and took out into the night, and it was terrible weather. It was raining. The streams were swollen. Some of the bridges were out. It was a terrible ride. He stopped on a couple of occasions to get a little coffee, get a fresh horse. And just before the vote on July 2nd, right around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, mud spattered, tired, sick, he stumbled across the threshold of the State House in Pennsylvania, and he voted yes for independence. So another one of those times where your one vote matters, one man mattered. The next day, John Adams wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail, and it's become a very famous letter because he said, the second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, fireworks, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. That's what we do on July 4th. Oops, that's not accurate. They voted on July 2nd. He wrote that letter on July 3rd. So why do we celebrate July 4th? Because it was on July 4th that they approved the final language of the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson and a committee of 4 others had written. Part of John Adams' letter that doesn't get as much attention is this. He said to his wife in the letter, "You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and to support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth it all, and that posterity will triumph in that day, even though we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not." In other words, they knew what they were doing. They knew that their lives were at risk, this may fail. So they approved the language of the Declaration, and on July 4th, Caesar Rodney wrote to his brother, Thomas. He said, "I traveled to Congress, though detained by thunder and rain, time enough to give my voice to the matter of independence. It is determined by the 13 united colonies without even one dissenting colony." And then he told his brother in the letter that soon you will see the Declaration because it will be printed and sent to the armies, the cities, and towns to be published. And then he ended his letter to his brother, please take care of the crops at harvest. So the last slide, please. These words are immortal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that we have these rights, most prominently life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founders said that they did this with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, and then they mutually pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. This language is more than something written on a piece of paper. They fought for it, but it also declares what our national aspiration is. This is what we say we believe. This is the thing that should hold all Americans together, whether you're born here or became a citizen from abroad. I think we've lost a lot of that glue holding us together, and one of the reasons we've lost it is because we've not always lived up to it. But nevertheless, that is what should hold us together. It would take the Civil War to end slavery. Some people have called the Civil War the last war of the American Revolution. But as a good friend of mine once said, America is a perfect idea. The United States is a work in progress. And if you saw the movie Private Ryan, this was the movie about a young man who was the last of his brothers surviving World War II. And the government decided to find out wherever he was and send him home because his brothers had already been lost, and they didn't want his mother to lose all of her sons. So Tom Hanks is the captain, and they go out and they finally find, in World War II in the fields of Europe, they find this man and they send him home. And he's wondering, why me? Why do I get to go home and my fellow soldiers don't? And if you remember the movie at the end of the scene at the end of the movie, he's now an older man, and he's on the field of Normandy. He's looking at the grave of the captain who led that group that saved him, because apparently one of the last things the captain said was, "Earn this." In other words, you're going home, you're going to live, earn it. And he looked at his wife as he's standing there many years later, and he looked at her and he said, "Have I been a good man?" In other words, did I earn this? And I think as Americans, we need to do the same thing. We need to look at the barons at Runnymede. We need to look at the Sons of Liberty and our founding fathers. And beyond that, the people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Throughout our history, as a work in progress, we've gotten better, but we're all shooting for that. And we need to ask ourselves, do we deserve it? And if we don't, we should examine ourselves and find out, then what can I do so that I can say that I deserve that as well? So that's our story for tonight. And next week, we're going to have Professor Lisa Hughes, who's going to do a deep dive into the Declaration of Independence and go through its history and all the language and all the clauses and really get deep into that. So if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to take them. I might even have an answer.
Joellen, I'm going to start with Victoria, who's viewing online. She's asking, why do you think King George was reluctant to agree to any of the colonists' requests?
Because it was a power struggle. And again, I think we can compare King George to King John, because they were asserting their authority. When you've got people under them, you know, it's almost like your children when you try to discipline them and they just push back. And if you feel if you give in, then you are giving up your power. You're defeated, you're humiliated. And the strain just got so bad in both cases that neither side was willing to give in, and so it caused a separation. I think King George is probably badly advised. And probably the worst advice he ever took was, don't read that petition.
That's a good answer.
Any other question? I can't see.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more.
Okay, well, I'll tell you one little story, then we'll quit because I love this story. 1939, there are 4 original copies of Magna Carta. That means 4 existing from 1215. One of them was in the United States in 1939 at the World's Fair in the British Pavilion. And when the war broke out, the British were afraid to ship it home because they were afraid the ship might be, you know, blown up by U-boats and so on, and they didn't want to lose this precious document. Well, we were concerned about our own documents because, you know, we forget that Washington, D.C., New York, those are all on our eastern coast. And there was genuine concern that the Germans might bomb our east coast. I mean, they had bombed England, they had bombed everybody else. So there was concern, and what would we do if they would bomb Washington, D.C.? Well, the British destroyed Washington, D.C. in 1814. What about the Constitution? What about these precious documents? So Archibald MacLeish, who was the Librarian of Congress, he took those documents plus thousands of others, and they shipped them to a couple of universities inland where they would be protected. But the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, our most sacred documents, were shipped down to Fort Knox in Tennessee. We took the British Magna Carta with us. So during World War II, those sacred documents of both of our countries spent the war and protection together. I think that's just a great story. And again, it tends to bring the history of British liberties and our liberties together under that great document, the Magna Carta. So thank you so much, and hope to see some of you next week.